Hi. It's good to see you again. It's been a bit of time, so it's great to be back with you today. This sermon, I want to start it with words from again, William Ellery Channing, and this is from a sermon he did called "Likeness to God," and it's one of the more important sermons, I think, in early Unitarian history, and as we go through, we can kind of find out why and talk about it a bit more. But he said that true religion consists in proposing as our great end a growing likeness to the Supreme Being. To honor God is not to tremble before Him as an unapproachable sovereign, not to utter barren praise which leaves us as it found us. It is to become what we praise. It is to thirst for the growth and invigoration of the divine principle within us. It is to seek the very Spirit of God. And I'll say as we get into this, I'll definitely be using some quotes from that time and place. And Channing in his time speaks a lot in male language, so I just want to recognize that and acknowledge that's a little outdated. And also that, the early Unitarians were more prone to prose than poetry. So some of the statements that they'll come out are a little potent but a little dry. So we'll get through them. But I think one of the questions that really drives my life is the nature of humanity. I think about it a lot. I think it's one of the most important questions in our lives. And it may sound a little blah or a little like, do I really think about that, or is that very important? But I actually think we ask this question, the nature of humanity, we're asking this question all the time. We ask it all the time, usually perhaps without even realizing it. Every encounter, every engagement, every news story, every book we read or show we watch, every sermon we hear is helping us answer this question: what is the nature of people? There's a saying that a conservative is a liberal who is mugged, and a liberal is a conservative who went to jail. And I think that's part of just reflecting that the reality of our perceptions is driven often by the experiences we see in the world. They help us frame how we perceive other people. Our answer to this question of who we are and who they are drives just about everything for us. How we approach life, how we trust, who we trust, whether we are prone to kindness or disregard, what our politics are, our inclinations to the stranger or the foreigner, how we raise our children, what work we seek, what religious communities we devote ourselves to, our basic sense of hope or despair in the world, even what we think about ourselves and those we love, I think is stirred by this question: what is our nature? Who are we as people? And I think we are constantly answering and asking that question: what is our nature? But usually without any real recognition that we're doing it. With a casual sense of despair when we see another awful thing on the news, we fear the stranger. With the witnessing of a generous act, we speak of our faith restored. Perhaps the most powerful, or one of the most powerful things we can do in this life is answer this question: what is our nature, with intention, that we don't let the winds of whatever comes before us decide our answer to that question, but rather than allow the subtle or not so subtle influences of the world to define this for us, we find it within ourselves to choose and hold that choice. That is sometimes called theology, our faith, or what we believe. As Unitarian Universalists, we are a non-creedal tradition, which means we never declare what you must believe to be part of our community. That's a very unique religious approach, and something I think many of us are very, very proud of. However, that openness sometimes makes it less obvious what we share in common, and that we have threads of belief that run through our history and our present. One of those common themes is a basic belief in the goodness of humanity. That is a trend that has existed throughout our faith tradition as far back as it goes. Our tradition has long stood against the ideas of a hateful God or the fundamental sinfulness of humanity or an eternal punishment for our misdeeds. These are things that we've often stepped out in opposition to these kinds of ideas. And both Unitarian and Universalism were formed in the United States in a time where those more harmful or harsh beliefs were very dominant in our country. We have valued forgiveness, we have valued dignity, hopefulness, wisdom, trust, love at the center. We have striven to be our best selves, to see our religious presence in the world through acts of goodness to our neighbor. To do so can feel like both a natural inclination, but also a conscious choice. We learn to do it better. We grow. And believe it or not, that, I believe, is religious. To grow, to learn, to become more inclined to treat the world with goodness. For those of you who are new to Unitarian Universalism, and maybe some of you even who've been around for a while, you may not know, probably many of you will know this, but that our lengthy name comes from two separate faith traditions that formed in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. But they later merged into one denomination around the 1960s. So that denomination's a little over 60 years old now. And that's Unitarianism and Universalism. Both faith traditions were born out of perceived heresies with Christianity. And in fact, to my knowledge, I think we're the only Unitarian and Universalism are the only denominational practices I know that are named after their heresy. So that's kind of cool. And Unitarian's heresy, if you will, is saying that God was one, and that Jesus was not the same as God. That God was unified, not trinified, not Trinitarian. Was not Trinitarian, but Unitarian. And Jesus was a remarkable person. And Universalism, which the core of that heresy was denying the existence of hell and affirming a God of love. It's actually really interesting. Within Universalism, there was a debate about what does happen after you die, and some of the early Universalists in our tradition believed that there wasn't a hell, but there was a purgatory. And maybe, and if you were really bad, like 10,000 years would probably get you back to the loving arms of God. But there was also another tradition called ultra-universalism, which believed that when you died, no matter what happened, you were embraced by that love of God. Perhaps because Unitarianism was a larger denomination and had a more famous history, after the merger, it really dominated our post-merger consciousness for quite a while. Unitarianism's intellectual side had more sway than the more heartfelt orientation of Universalism in our early years. But over time, the richness of Universalism's focus on love fascinated many in our ranks and became a place to deepen spiritually, to dive into Universalism. But over time, but it certainly, and that certainly did for me. Just that Universalism was very powerful for me, as love has always been at the center of my belief system. But there also is a depth of soul within Unitarianism that we often overlook. It's a side part of our faith tradition that we don't pay a lot of attention to, because we mostly focus on that Jesus is a person concept. But there's a flip side to why we started to believe that, and that has helped me connect with Unitarianism in a new and I think more beautiful way. We often describe Unitarianism as the tradition that denied that Jesus was God. But I believe there's actually a deeper spiritual principle behind that choice. Why did we say that? Why was that important for us to bring that forth? And I believe that statement was less a statement about who Jesus was and more a statement about who we are. By claiming Jesus as human, Jesus becomes an example of who we can be. If Jesus is God, his life is different from us. There's a separation. He is doing things that we could never do. Only the divine could accomplish that. But if he's human, then he is someone showing us the way. He's teaching us how to live to our greatest potential. His life challenges us to live like him. And I believe the underlying principle that truly makes Unitarianism special is the belief that each one of us can grow to, if you will, be more like God. That we have that capacity within us. William Ellery Channing, considered, again, the father of American Unitarianism, one of the great early founders of it within our country, said exactly this. In Channing's most famous sermon, which is called Unitarian Christianity, he lays out the principle of God's unity, where he describes what we most associate Unitarianism with. He wrote, "We believe in the doctrine of God's unity, or that there is one God and only one. We believe that Jesus is one mind, one soul, one being as truly we are, and equally distinct from the one God." But it is in Channing's sermon, likeness to God. That other one, the Unitarian Christianity, that's his most famous sermon. But I think likeness to God, and a mentor of mine really drew me to this. I think that's where he may have expressed some of his most important ideas, and in some case may have been his most important sermon for what he expressed there. And it gives a theological and religious center to Unitarianism that I think we have often missed. He wrote, "True religion consists in proposing as our great end a growing likeness to the Supreme Being. To honor God is not to tremble before him as an unapproachable sovereign, not to utter barren praise which leaves us as it found us." I love that phrase. Not to utter barren praise which leaves us as it found us. It is to become what we praise. It is to thirst for the growth and invigoration of the divine principle within us. It is to seek the very Spirit of God. He also says, and this one's a little rough, but it's powerful. He says, "We approach our Creator by every right exertion of the powers he gives us. Whenever we invigorate the understanding by honestly and resolutely seeking truth, and by withstanding whatever might warp the judgment. Whenever we invigorate the conscience by following it in opposition to the passions. Whenever we receive a blessing gratefully, bear a trial patiently, or encounter peril or scorn with moral courage. Whenever we think, speak, or act with moral energy and resolute devotion to duty, be the occasion ever so humble, obscure, or familiar, then the divinity is growing within us, and we are ascending towards our author." Lastly, he says, "Above all, adore God's unutterable goodness, but remember that this attribute is particularly proposed to you as your model, that God calls you both by nature and revelation to a fellowship in his philanthropy." Another one, that God calls you to a fellowship in his philanthropy, that he has placed you in social relations for the very end of rendering you ministers and representatives of his benevolence. Again, forgive the male language, but I hope you hear the depth there. Although Channing does not mention the phrase explicitly in this sermon, he and others of his time would speak of a divine seed within each of us. They'd use that metaphor, divine seed, which is different than some other traditions use, like for example, a divine light was a common metaphor, but he chose seed, which I thought was very, very powerful. And he says that this seed is a seed that true religion was obligated to help grow, that we each have this divine seed within us, that religion's purpose was to help that grow. As an example, Channing worked very closely with Elizabeth Peabody, who brought the kindergarten movement to the United States and created the first English-speaking kindergartens within the United States. Kindergarten is German for children's garden. That comes from that divine seed kind of concept, and the kindergarten movement approached education with an understanding that children were naturally good and active learners, which was, for the time, a quite radical belief, and in some ways may still be radical even today. And that's the beauty of the divine seed metaphor. Divinity is within us, but it must be cultivated. It's not automatic. It's not given to us easily, necessarily. It's something that has to grow and grow within us. And that's what helps me when confronted with evil in the world, that although we each have this seed of goodness within us, it does not always grow. It must be tended, it must be watered or fed, given light and love. It needs safe homes and good doctors and great schools and true religion to help it grow. Basically, we can't do it alone. I believe that moral development is a lifelong process. It doesn't stop as after we stop being children. And moral development keeps going. Our bodies may, for the most part, stop growing, but I think moral development continues throughout our whole lives. We grow into adults and then into elders. For me, growing into the divine as I understand it is an increasing expansion of our own self-awareness and sense of relatedness to all things. That's maybe a little different than some senses of what it means to become God, or become, to grow into God. But for me, it's that increasing expansion of our own self-awareness and a sense of relatedness to all things. As a newborn, for example, we begin with a sense of self which we can call egocentric. I am it. I am everything. The child, the baby, perceives themselves as all that is. Their experience is the world's experience. My experience is the only experience, for example. And as we grow, we actually grow into, and these are all documented ways of growing, we grow into what could be called an ethnocentric perspective, which means I am, instead of I am it, it means I am my family, I am my religion, I am my country, my race, my gender, I am my group. And then we can grow into a world-centric perspective. I am a citizen of the world. Most people don't grow out of the ethnocentric perspective. They tend to stop there. But we can continue to grow. We can grow into a world-centric perspective. I am a citizen of the world. You and I are in this together. And lastly, we can grow into what some call a cosmocentric perspective. I am all. We are one. And when we think of some of the greatest exemplars of humanity, when we think of them and what they talk about and how they exhibit their lives, they show this extraordinary capacity to see themselves as part of the all, to see themselves as deeply, deeply, profoundly connected to each and every one of us and beyond. And that shows up often in a life of incredible love and often significant sacrifice for the goodness of all. Channing said something fascinating. He said, likeness to God must be a principle of sympathy or accordance with creation. For the creation is a birth and shining forth of the divine mind, a work through which his Spirit breathes. As we receive this Spirit, we discern more and more of God in everything, from the frail flower to the everlasting stars. What if we really, truly saw this as the purpose of religion? To bring forth the teachings of one of our exemplars from nearly 200 years ago, that we as a faith community dedicate ourselves to the moral development of every person, that we see ourselves as helping people grow in their capacity to expand their sense of self. Every sermon, every gathering, every class, cultivating the divine seed in every person. This begins, of course, by recognizing that this is something that we have to do for ourselves. It might it might offer some of the hope that our world so desperately needs these days. As Channing said, the great end in religious instruction is not to impose a religion upon them in the form of arbitrary rules, but to awaken the conscience, the moral discernment. In a word, the great end is to awaken the soul. Shalom, amen, and blessed be.